I'm Joel, I'm the pastor of the church, and for those of you that brought kids or youth this morning, you're probably going to be a little bit more locked in this morning because I'm hoping that they're going to ask you, what was that all about? Like, do people just normally wander into the service and start yelling and shouting? Not always, but it does happen on occasion. And I'd actually encourage you, if you brought kids, if you brought youth with you, to kind of follow up because, there's a good chance that they'll be all hyped up after the great things they're learning downstairs. They'll probably eat a few too many cookies than you would want them to eat following the service and really ramped up on sugar. But have the conversation with them so that we can explore faith together. If you are just joining us for the first time, you're coming at a good Sunday this morning because we're just wrapping up a series where we have been asking some what I believe are critical questions. Questions that, regardless of where you land in terms of faith, regardless of whether you are a follower of Jesus or not, these are questions that we all wrestle with. Questions that we don't want pat answers to. Questions that we don't just want to kind of walk away and say, whatever, I'll just keep moving on. But questions that have the profound ability to shape life and impact perspective. Questions that I believe can ultimately be found when we turn back to God and say, what do you have to say about this? And so we've looked at questions around dealing with success, or maybe on the flip side, overcoming disappointment. We've asked questions around suffering. And so if you've missed a Sunday, if you've missed a week, it's always better to have you live. But if you need to track with us, you can jump onto our website and you can just click on Watch Sunday's Message and you can watch it at your own convenience to see, how do we start to answer some of these questions? And so this morning, we're going to deal with a question that I think lands all of us into the same place. Maybe it's a situation that you are dealing with right now. Maybe it's a time in your past that, although you think you've moved on, it's kind of like a little bit of baggage that you just can't shed. It's the question where we simply ask, what do I do? What do I do when I mess up? What do I do when I make mistakes and I have regret and I make decisions that I wish I could go back and change, but we know we can't? And so how do we respond? I don't know how familiar you are with the Bible or with some of the biblical characters, but there's certain people in the Bible that more people are likely aware of. People in the Bible that, we name churches after or we name our own children after. People like Peter in the Bible. And one of the challenges, I think, sometimes is when we read the Bible and we go to the characters like Peter, we think of these incredible pillars of faith. We think of the amazing things that God has done in them and through them, and we think, well, I'm not really like them. I can't really relate to them. But if we start to dig in a little bit deeper, we begin to realize that we do have a lot in common with some of these so-called pillars of faith. They may not name a church after you, but as we dig in a little bit deeper, we start to see what are the incredible realities of how God meets us in the messes of life. I think the reality is we make mistakes. We make poor decisions. The Bible uses a 3-letter word. It calls it sin. And sometimes we don't like to talk about sin. It's a dirty little word, and we think, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to come to church, and I don't want to hear about it. But I think one of the challenges is when we don't actually admit that we mess up and we make mistakes, then how is it that we're going to deal with it on our own? Often in my own experience, in my life, and in the lives of other people, I see there's oftentimes kind of 2 ditches that we fall into. The first ditch that we fall into is when we mess up, when we make mistakes, we try to bury it. We just try to move on. And we do it in a number of ways. We can justify it. We can talk about how, that was in the past. We can even excuse it. And one of my personal favorites of when I know I'm trying to bury it, I compare it to other people. I think, well, you know what, I made a mistake, and that was not a wise decision, and I shouldn't have done it, but, it's not as bad as so-and-so down the street, or, that other person across town. And we begin to excuse it, but does it make it go away? Does it make it any better? You see, sometimes I start to realize that when we choose to bury our mistakes, it's not only the initial mistake that causes problems, it's what begins to grow within and inside of us. 2 years ago, as a family, we got to spend some time in Thailand. And one of the days, I remember specifically, I noticed my leg was starting to get a little bit itchy. And so what do normal people do when their leg gets itchy? Well, they start to itch it. Well, I noticed over the course of the day, it was getting itchier and itchier and itchier. So I thought, maybe I should actually take a look at this thing that I'm itching. And I noticed it was like just a little bite, like a little bite, like little, teeny little bite. I thought, it's good, no problem. But I'm going to keep itching this sucker like it's nobody's business, right? And so then I think, okay, maybe I should take a look at it again. And then started to notice that it started to get pretty red and swollen, right? And I thought, oh, okay, this is not good. I'm just going to ignore it. I'm going to be good. It's going to sort itself out later, right? Well, a few more hours pass by. It's now getting into the late hours of the night. Why is it that we always seem to have to deal with these things late at night? Like, it's like all wisdom and understanding and knowledge, like, leave me, right? The reality is that's when I had the conversation with Rebecca. And she's like, let me look at that thing. What is that thing? And now this little teeny weeny bite that was now red and was now swollen now got me worried, because there was this red line that was now leaving the rest of the party and going down my leg. I thought, I'm not a smart guy, but I know that's not a good thing. And so modern day technology, I took a picture of it and sent it to my brother, because he's an emerge doc. And in our family, it goes like this. He got the smarts, and I got the good looks. Why are you all laughing? Yeah. And so I sent it to him. My brother's like, Joel, go to the hospital, you blank, right? We won't get into the personal conversations that we have, right? And so I went to the hospital, and I showed it to the doctor, and she's like, yep. That's a spider bite. You don't want to get bitten by those spiders. And I'm like, it's not like I was hanging out with the spiders asking them to bite me. Like, thank you for that. And they gave me some antibiotics, and I took some antibiotics, and the next few days, everything got sorted out. But I think sometimes we deal with our mess-ups and our sin in that way. We bury it, and we think, it's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a mistake. It's not going to impact me really that much. But what we don't realize is it starts to grow. An infection starts to take place. And it starts to impact our lives in other ways. Well, maybe you're not someone who buries their mistakes. Maybe you fall in the other ditch and you're happy to own it. You're happy to acknowledge your mistakes. But instead of burying your mistakes, you allow your mistakes to bury you. You live with this sense of guilt, this residual feeling of just how you have messed up. And no matter how bad you feel, no matter how sorry you feel, you just seemingly can't get it off your back. It's almost as if you start to believe the lie that I can't even forgive myself for what I've done. And if I can't forgive myself, then maybe God won't forgive me either. And we start to heap guilt upon guilt upon guilt. Is that how we deal with our messes in life? When I was in university a number of years ago, a good friend of mine was not a Christian, and she knew that I was. And so I would openly talk about my faith and talk about the impact it was making. And one day, I even got the courage up to invite her to join me at church. I said, you know what? Why don't you come to church? It's, on a Sunday morning. It's, a Sunday morning, asking someone to get up a little bit earlier is a tough sell in university life. But I thought, hey, why don't you come? And it's great. And in the back of my mind, I kind of thought she was going to say no, but not for the reason she gave. I thought she'd say, oh, you know what, I'm busy, or I'm just not going to work. It's not going to work out for me. And she looked me square in the eyes and she says, Joel, why would I want to do that? I'll only end up feeling worse about myself. I thought, wow. Is that the message that we often give to others? Is that the reality of what when we speak of this good news of Jesus, that it is like this massive hammer that is going to come down and just crush you and fill you with even more guilt? That we allow the messes in our lives to completely bury us? And so I found in my life and in the lives of others that regardless of whatever ditch you fall into, neither of them bring us to the incredible promise that God gives to us through Jesus, and that is the abundant life. Jesus says, I have come not so that you can excuse your mistakes, not so that I can beat you up over your mistakes, but so that you can have the abundant life. And what I start to realize more and more is that how we deal with our mistakes, our mess-ups, our sin, not only impact us in our relationship with God, but it has an impact upon those around us as well. That when we live lives, when we just bury our mistakes and just say, oh, it's not really that big of a deal, we're conveying to people there is really no need for Jesus in your life. Or if we allow the mistakes and the mess-ups to completely beat us down, and as followers of Jesus, we don't live with a sense of hope, we don't live with a sense of joy, we're basically telling others what my friend told me. Come to Jesus so you can feel worse about yourself. Do we want to put that up on our sign? And so it's important for us to understand that the way in which we live, the mistakes in which we make, how we respond to them, not only impact our lives, it has an impact upon the lives around us. And as you start to read the Bible, as you start to read more and more the stories of Jesus, the biographies of Jesus, the gospel, the word, you see an incredible thing happening. You see the people of Jesus' day that would be thrown wholeheartedly into the category of mess-ups are the ones that flock to Jesus. And the ones who have the hardest time with Jesus are the so-called religious folk, the people who think they've got it all together. And they're so messed up because they see tax collectors, they see prostitutes, they see people who are clearly living lives contrary to what God intends for them, just coming to Jesus and wanting to eat with Jesus. And the people who seemingly have it all together, the people I would say bury their mess-ups, say, why is Jesus hanging out with them? And Jesus overhears it one time and says, you want to know why? Because I have come for the sick, not the healthy. I have come essentially to call those who truly need and recognize their need for God. And so how do we respond? If it's not bury it, if it's not be buried by it, what is our response? And that's why we come back to the story of Peter. Maybe you're familiar with his story, or maybe it's the first time you're hearing it this morning. But Peter was with Jesus for 3 years. He was, in many accounts, his right-hand guy. He saw the miracles. He heard the teachings. He saw the people flocking to Jesus. And then as we read and as we saw, there came a time where Jesus said to him, listen, you're going to mess up. You're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter's like, no, not me. The rest of the guys might, not me. And then he does. at the hour that we could argue the time when Jesus needed his people the most, his people walked away. Peter denied Jesus when Jesus needed him the most. And you would think in that moment, Peter felt horrible. I mean, we see it. He went away sobbing. He went away upset. He went this way disappointed. Clearly, he was sorry for what he did. But I think when we mess up, there needs to be a step beyond just, I'm sorry. I wish I didn't. I will try better. What is that step? Well, fortunately for us, Peter's mess up doesn't end there. If you jump all the way to the end of John's gospel, John chapter 21, I would encourage you this week, maybe take some time to just read this chapter. I'm just going to skim through it here this morning. But this is following Jesus' death and then resurrection. Jesus' friends are out in a boat and they're fishing. And after a long night of fishing, they're coming into shore and they see a guy standing on the edge of the water. And at first, they don't notice who he is. But then John tells us that Peter recognizes that it is Jesus. Now, we want to pause there. Because if you're someone who believes that if you go to Jesus, there's going to be incredibly more sense of guilt and just judgment and just feeling terrible about yourself, that kind of contradicts what Peter does next. Because Peter jumps out of the boat. Now, the boat is going into shore. And so Peter jumps out of the boat into the water, and you may be thinking, wow, maybe Peter's not wanting to go into shore. He's going to swim further out into the sea. But no, Peter jumps into the water and starts swimming to get to the shore to see Jesus. That tells you something. That tells you that Peter recognized what he had done. And he recognized he needed to get right with Jesus. And then there's this amazing scene where they have breakfast together. I mean, Jesus made breakfast for these guys. They deserted him. They abandoned him. And Jesus made breakfast for them. And then after breakfast, Peter and Jesus are sitting around the fire. The setting has been reset. Peter denied Jesus 3 times around the fire. And here Jesus is with Peter, and 3 times Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" And each time, Peter responds, "Yes, Lord, I love you." And then Jesus would say something that might seem a little off for us. He goes, "Feed my sheep, feed my lambs." And then eventually he says, "Come and follow me." And you can ask the question, why is Jesus beating it to death? Why asking 3 times? Because Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And Jesus wasn't putting it on Peter. He was wanting to deal specifically with the situation, to fully restore him in the midst of all of life. And then it was there that Jesus said, "Follow me." You see, the incredible message of this abundant life is that even in the midst of our mess-ups, even in the midst of our mistakes, we are told not to bury it. We are told not to be buried by it. We are told to give it to Jesus, to come to him. So not only will we be healed, will we be forgiven, we'll be restored, but that we can then be used by God. You see, some of us may believe the lie that, yes, I know I can be forgiven, but because of my past, can God really use me? And we think our mistakes and our mess-ups disqualify us from ministry. Wasn't the case with Peter, and it shouldn't be the case with you as well. in the back of your bulletin, a couple thoughts for you to perhaps consider this week. One of the things I begin to realize is one of the amazing ways that God works in our lives is often using our mess-ups, once they've been forgiven and redeemed, to become a vital part of ministry. I keep coming back to this quote. It says, people admire your success, but they relate to your failures. Have you ever considered that when you come to Jesus, not only will he forgive you and he will restore you, but he may even use that very mess up to impact the lives of others. I love these words of the Apostle John, the one who would have recorded the account of Jesus and Peter. I'm purely speculating. I have no grounds to stand for any of this, but I wonder if when John said these words, he was thinking of that image of Peter and Jesus at the fire. When he says, if we confess our sins, Jesus is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from our unrighteousness. Amazing thing about Peter's life is that you continue to read. You see that God did use him in an incredible way. Peter actually did fulfill that vow that he made to Jesus when he says, I will even die for you. Scholars tell us that Peter was crucified for his faith because he would refuse to deny Jesus. He was given that second opportunity, and probably a third, and probably a fourth, and probably a fifth. We all mess up. We all make mistakes. The key is in how will we respond. Don't bury it. Don't be buried by it. Bring it to Jesus so that we can be forgiven. We can be restored. We can be used by God. Because when we do, it not only impacts us, it has an impact upon those that don't even know Jesus yet. And so what is our response? I'm going to suggest two things here this morning. The first one may be for people this morning that have never actually taken that step and said, Jesus, I need you in my life. I want you in my life. I have been burying things. I've been buried by things for far too long. I want you to be my Lord and my Savior. One of the ways we celebrate that is through baptism, through a public confession of faith. When we come forward and we don't say, hey, look at all the great things I've done. We say, listen, I recognize my need for Jesus in my life. And you know what people do at baptisms? They celebrate, they applaud, they cheer because it's so awesome to see people recognizing, Jesus, I need you in my life. And I believe we celebrate and applaud not only for that moment, but for the moments that are going to come when God is going to use them. And so maybe God is nudging you that way this morning. Maybe you felt like Peter did when the rooster crowed and you said, enough is enough. I would love to have a conversation with you. Maybe you're not ready to talk face to face yet, but if you are, I'll be at the back. We can have a conversation. If not, drop me an email this week, a chance to just talk about what God can do in your life. There's a second thing we're going to do this morning. Everyone's invited to take this step. And that is we're going to come to what we call the Lord's table. And we're going to celebrate something that's been celebrated amongst Christians for over 2,000 years because Jesus celebrated it with his closest friends. And even though Jesus knew that his friends were going to desert him and deny him and were going to leave him, he still said, listen, this is what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to allow my body to be broken and I'm going to allow my blood to flow because I love you that much. I want you to be forgiven and restored and healed. And so Christians around the world over the centuries come and they break this bread, and some of us drink from these little cups as a reminder Not only of what Jesus has done, but what Jesus is going to do. And so we are invited to come, to recognize the times that we have fallen down, but we want to be forgiven. We want to be restored. We don't want to bury our mistakes. We don't want to carry them around. We want to bring them to Jesus, and that's what this table represents. And so allow God to speak into your life. You know, God reveals the messes in our lives not to make us feel bad about them, but so that he can remove them from our lives. A loving God would not just simply say, hey, listen, I'm never going to bring this up because you know what, just deal with it on your own. No. So there are times when God reveals things in our lives that we need to get right with him, and maybe God is doing that in your life here right now. Give it over to him. Experience that forgiveness in your life. I'm just going to pray, and then we're going to sing a song. And then we're going to come and we're going to celebrate this together. And so allow God to be speaking in your life here today. Let us pray.